to go? In which case, fellow members of the Grand Antiquity Society, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2021 instance of the Grand Antiquity Society of Glasgow annual lecture. As you may be aware, the lecture was instituted to celebrate the city of Glasgow, particularly its architecture and history, and tonight is no exception. If I can give you a little bit of housekeeping, at the end of the lecture, we hope to have some time for some questions and answers. Please may I ask you to post your questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom, and this will allow us to pose the questions to tonight's speaker. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail, as the information I could give you was circulated by our gallant clerk with the notice of the lecture. So quickly to summarize. Tonight's speaker is Professor Richard Oram. Professor Oram is currently of the University of Stirling and is a former director of the Centre for Environment, Heritage and Policy. He's published extensively on the environmental history of Scotland. And the subject of tonight's lecture is the Dear Green Place, Glasgow's Millennium of Global Environmental Impact. At this time of COP26, what could be more appropriate? Professor Richard, I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight and to look forward with great anticipation to what you have to tell us. So with no further ado, sir, the floor and the audience is yours.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great pleasure and an honour to be here this evening to give you this talk at the end of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow. To be clear, I'm not talking about the environmental science. I won't be talking about the ecology. This is environmental history. And what I'm going to try to do in the 40 or 45 minutes I've got available to me is actually cover a millennium in Glasgow's development and look at the different ways in which the presence of Glasgow has affected the environmental development both of the city itself, the region within which it stands, and touch on aspects of its global footprint. It's not going to be hectoring or badgering you to do more. It is simply highlighting the ways in which everything is connected one way or another, and maybe give you some things to think about in terms of what can be done for the future. I'll finish with just a few observations about where do we go from here, from COP26. So without much further ado, I too will now remove me from your presence and share my screen, which hopefully will come up with my presentation. There we go. Okay, so a Dear Green Place, the environmental impact of Glasgow. Now, we've actually got to start really with just setting out a couple of principles, and it's Newton's third law is the one that actually has the greatest pertinence to all of this. And that's the one that, to summarize it, is that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And it's something to think about in terms of environmental experience and what we do, in the sense that we often hear being bandied around single step solutions. If we do this, then we solve that problem, without actually thinking through what all the other ramifications are. And that some relatively simple things that we might consider as being good to do actually will have profound and long-lasting negative consequences. And simply stopping doing something also doesn't reverse a process. It'll take a lot of interventions and a lot of collective action to begin to turn around what was really, as I say, 1,000 years of environmental impacts. So, environmental change, climate change, and human responses to it, neither of these things are independent of each other. Neither of them determines absolutely what way something is going to go. And one of the things all the way through any environmental history discussion you really need to be thinking about is that we may be subject to things like climate change. We may be subject to things like resource limitations, but ultimately it's not either of those things that really drives forward how the human population is affected. It's how the human population chooses to respond to, adapt to, be resilient in those changing circumstances. So we're not powerless, but nor are we the ones who are necessarily always in control. So just a little bit of background. I won't be asking you questions on this graph. This one's relatively old. It's much more refined now. This was produced in 2010. But what it shows us over the era that really Glasgow as a large scale settlement evolved, the climate has been through a couple of cycles, beginning shortly before 1000, with the development of what's known as the medieval climate anomaly, the MCA that you can see on the left-hand side of the graph as you look at it. And this is a period of generally above average temperatures, of more stable weather conditions. And these really provided a context for population growth, for stimulus in the expansion of agriculture, things of that kind. Now, it wasn't an era of perpetual barbecue summers and things like that. As you could see simply by looking at this graph, there are, even though you've got that high curve going across there, there's quite a lot of jagged drops within it. And these are periods of more disturbed weather, but against the average across the period, things were generally warmer and stabler. And then round about 1250, 1256, 57 to be exact, things really begin to turn bad. This is the beginning of a slide into the second of the major periods, which is there on the graph as the LIA, the Little Ice Age. And before that really starts to become entrenched, there are two particular episodes to think about. One there is called the wolf, the other one is the spura, and these are minimums of solar sunspot activity. And in those eras, you have prolonged periods of colder and wetter and stormier conditions. So the wolf minimum lasting from about 1280 through to the early 1350s, the spura from the 1440s through to the 1550s. And both of these herald that there's a real significant change coming about, that our ancestors who have become used to, who had adjusted their lives to the generally better conditions of the medieval climate anomaly, had to begin to make big adjustments, and very, very rapidly. Now, none of this really has any kind of equivalence to what we're seeing now, which is there at the end of the graph as the warming. And as you see, from 1848, which is the last extreme winter of the Little Ice Age, from 1848 onwards, temperatures have climbed on almost an annual basis. And although that graph shows it tailing off, it's now we've got the data shows that it continues to rise even higher, with 2018 being the warmest year on record so far in this decade. So there's your broad background, and even within it, I'll just draw attention to another thing in red there on the graph is a thing called the Dantean anomaly, so called because in the last year of that anomaly, Dante Alighieri, the poet, the author of the Divine Comedy, dies, and so the discoverer of that anomaly named it the Dantean. And this is just a good little example of how intense climate response in a very, very short window of time can have catastrophic consequences for a population, and an agricultural population in particular, such as would have been the majority of the inhabitants of medieval Glasgow. In this period, we have got almost continuous summer rains, cooler conditions, saturated conditions, and it coincides with two great events, both of whom have more or less dropped out of popular consciousness. One is the great cattle epizootic, the great cattle plague that rolls westwards across Europe out of the Eurasian steppes from around about 1370 onwards, where it is estimated that around about 85% in some areas, or as low as 75% in others, of the bovine population, so that's all dairy cows, milk, really under threat, beef cattle, but also your draft oxen, things like that, dying. Now, if a crop fails, you can regenerate within a year if the following season is successful. But if your livestock dies, it takes you years to recover from it. Almost as soon as that's underway, you've also got the major impacts of the human catastrophe in this, which is the Great European Famine, spanning the period from about 1315 through to 1322. And if you say it quickly, only 10% of the population died. Doesn't sound very much when you say it fast, but this is true decimation. And for most of Scotland's rural populations, a tenth of your adult manpower dying in one episode would have been catastrophic in the extreme. So that's just to give you a flavour of the way in which the climate affects us. But people also responded to and changed the ways in which they acted to respond to these kinds of challenges, developing a greater resilience in the face of change. Now, Glasgow, of course, is older than just 1,000 years. There's been a settlement in the general area of the cathedral, certainly extending back into the early historic period. But it is the establishment of a major religious centre here and the growth around it of a dependent community, one that's servicing the needs of that urban centre, that really begins the profound transformation of the land around about Glasgow. And we need to recognise that as soon as you get settlement, you are changing the way in which the land appears, the land is used. It's been converted into arable land. You are getting the clearance of woodland to provide both fuel for cooking and heating fires, but also timber for building. You've got the conversion of a lot of this land into open grassland for grazing of the livestock, again, to support the human population of the city. So it's transforming already the ecology of the surrounding district. And once it gets rights as a market centre, the bishops of Glasgow secure that privilege from the King of Scots, you start to see that reach of demand for particular commodities spreading wider than the immediate hinterland of Glasgow, and people across a wider district extending up into the Kelvin Valley to the north, out beyond Rutherglen and into North Lanarkshire to the east and southeast, and west along the north side of the Clyde through into the territory around what now is Clydebank. People there are starting to change the ways in which they produce what they're producing to service the market and the demand for the growing population within Glasgow itself. And this has a profound impact on that landscape, as I've already said. You're getting the settlement and its own fields expanding north and west, up the slopes from the High Street, up over the old glacial drumlins, along the lines heading up towards Blythswood Square, and across the line of the M8 to the north. This is old agricultural land that is being redeveloped. They're producing high volumes of the main dietary staples of the townsfolk, principally oats and barley, but with a small amount of wheat. They're still growing things in their garden plots associated with the houses. And then beyond this, you've got an arc of grassland, studded with livestock of the people of Glasgow, but intensively grazed. And through that intensive grazing, they're already transforming a landscape that had been dominated by hazel, willow, alder, birch woodland into an open landscape of ecologically stunted grassland. And that's what intensive grazing does ultimately. And so probably still within the late 12th, early 13th century, the sochs, the willows that give their name to Sauchie Hall Street, had all but vanished from the surrounding district. And we see evidence for the way in which the voracious appetite of Glasgow for materials, for foodstuffs, had an impact on its own agricultural hinterland before the end of the 13th century. We've got the charter evidence. In 1277, Maurice, the Lord of Luss, he's the ancestor of the Cahoon family, he sold the bishop and chapter of Glasgow Cathedral the right to cut timber anywhere on his lands over there on the west side of Loch Lomond to complete the construction of the predecessor of the stone steeple that still rises above Glasgow Cathedral. So to complete the construction of that, and also the roof of the Treasury building, which is just on the north side below the steeple. They were also given the right to carry the wood into Glasgow by whatever means was most convenient to them, by ox cart, by draught horse, down through the various routeways from the south end of Loch Lomond, or by water, floating it down the Leven, and then either barging it up the Clyde from Dumbarton, or along the north shore of the river, whatever was most appropriate and suited their needs. And as I say, this is one of our clearest indications that big timbers, big standards, as they're known, have gone from the landscape around Glasgow. And it becomes a characteristic of Glasgow. If you look at the earliest depictions of the city from, well, Timothy Pont's map from the 1590s onwards, it is a bare landscape. There is very, very little tree cover outside the gardens around the big mansion houses up in the Chanonry area beside the cathedral and extending down the Drygate and round there. So an open, bare landscape that if you even wanted to build wickerwork fences, you were having to bring the materials in from a long distance away from Glasgow proper. So what little remained, probably in parts of the valleys of the Mollendinner, along the banks of the Kelvin, for example, this willow, hazel and alder particularly, it's being heavily managed from the 12th century. If you go slightly further out, down the Clyde towards Old Kilpatrick, for example, we've got references in 1233 to a great house of wickerwork in which a gentleman called Bede Ferdan lived beside the church at Old Kilpatrick. So there is still production of carefully managed coppice wood that can be woven into wattle for walling or basketry for, well, baskets and carriage materials. That's being controlled, but it is in diminishing supply already. And we need to think that actually within much of northern Lanarkshire, of eastern Renfrewshire and eastern Dumbartonshire, there was probably little, if anything, remaining of what we might class as natural woodland by the early 1200s. And this is something to think about when you go out to modern Glasgow's playground around Loch Lomond. And although this is still often, or rather the woodland on the lower part of the slope, you can see the, oh, sorry, apologies. On the lower part of the slope here above the water of the loch, there is a band of oak wood. This is often presented as natural, but this is one of the most important early cultural landscapes that's been influenced by Glasgow. This is a resource similar to what Maurice of Luss was giving them over on the opposite shore of the loch. This is being used for oak bark, for leather tanning. It's being used for timber. It's being used to produce charcoal. All of the raw resources of wood that are needed for the emergent craft and industrial complex that is present in late medieval Glasgow. Now, another thing to bear in mind about consequences of this stripping of the natural woodland and the changing of the face of the land is, particularly as the climate began to deteriorate in the later medieval period, it has a major consequence for water runoff. And we start to see increasing references to flood taking place on rivers around Scotland, and the Clyde is one of the rivers that sees flood, particularly because the deforestation is also happening in Upper Clydesdale, way down there in southern Lanarkshire. So you've got a much more rapid runoff of water after any heavy rain or in snow melt and things of that kind. Now, in the earlier days, the inhabitants of the communities round about Glasgow had generally stayed above the level of the floodplain. They understood, as modern planners are really having to start to remember, that floodplains are called floodplains for a very, very good reason. And yes, you can use the floodplain. It's being brought into cultivation. It's used for rich seasonal grazing in the water meadows and things like that. But as settlement begins to become more pressured, as areas for settlement rather begin to become more pressured, you start to get that creep of settlement into these territories. And even old settlements are still prone to spectacular events, as this Auchinleck Chronicle entry from 1460 reports. There was in Recht Great Spate in Clyde, the 25th and 26th day of November. The whilk broch doon hail hoose, bairns and mills, and put all the tune of Govan in a float while they sat on the hoose. So Govan, not being a Rangers supporter, I'm not particularly bothered by this, but Govan is completely flooded out, and the people there are sitting on rooftops to avoid the floodwaters. But Govan is one of the oldest settlements in the area around Glasgow, and even it wasn't immune to these great spectacular flood events that come with, in this case, the Spörer minimum as the Little Ice Age is dawning. Now that's a canter through the Middle Ages, and we get to the point where things really begin to take off at the close of the medieval period. And one of the things that we need to reflect on is that despite the fact that Glasgow was the seat of the second richest bishopric in Scotland, it's got a university from the 1450s. It is still, in medieval Scottish terms, a relatively small community and a relatively minor player in anything other than local trade. Trade is still dominated by routes to mainland Europe, to the Baltic, and of course that's coming to the East Coast ports, Aberdeen, Dundee, and Edinburgh Leith in particular by the late medieval period. But all of that begins to change when Christopher Columbus goes sailing west in 1492. And here on the screen, we've got a map of the world as it was known just the year before Columbus headed west. No Americas. Everything is focused on Europe and Asia, parts of North Africa. The rest of the African continent is still also terra incognita. But the opening up of a new world to the west is going to transform the fortunes of Atlantic-facing ports and cities such as Glasgow. But having said that, we need to bear in mind that it's around a further century to century and a half before Glasgow is going to begin to benefit from the development of that transatlantic trade. Now, it's in the 17th century that this really begins to take off. And although we're talking about trade, that has consequence in environmental terms and major consequences in health terms as well for the people of Scotland and Europe more generally. And the big trigger for it is the Royal Administration in Scotland is looking for ways to stimulate Scotland's economic base, effectively to increase the potential tax yield. And one of the things they do is they issue licenses to groups of speculators drawn both from the burgess class and the aristocracy to begin the establishment of what are referred to as manufactories. And some of these, the early ones, are around things like glass manufacture, soap manufacture. But in the 1660s, it is the opportunities in the Atlantic trade that are beginning to show where things are going. And it is first of all sugar that they are drawn to, and then latterly tobacco and cotton in the following century. Now, sugar and its byproduct, chiefly rum, is the first of the new industries to arrive in Glasgow. And the Wester Sugar House is founded in 1667, and the Easter Sugar House, which is the illustration here, comes 2 years later. And with that, really, we're almost 350 years now into Scots' addiction to the sweet stuff. And we're still living with the dietary legacy of that. And we really have to recognize that there is a voracious appetite for sugar at home, and for the rum that is being distilled from the molasses, the byproduct, if you like. That's mainly being exported from the city, but also consumed in bulk within the city. And that drove the development of processing centres right up and down the Clyde below Glasgow. And ultimately, as ships began to get bigger in the 18th century, they were no longer easy to bring large cargoes upriver to Glasgow. So Greenock in particular, think Tate and Lyle, really takes over as the sugar manufacturing centre in Scotland before the end of the first decade of the 19th century. And that ends the sugar industry in Glasgow. And this watercolour actually shows the suggery just as it's about to be demolished. Its roof has already been removed. Now, although that industry goes, the technological developments that went with this large-scale distillation and refining process is one of the things that's now recognised as having laid the roots of the know-how that provides the new technology in chemical processing in particular, that's going to service the needs of the new cotton spinning and iron working industries that are growing up all the way from Glasgow up into the lower Clyde Valley. And just think about David Dale and co at New Lanark producing cotton. Now that cotton's being imported through, the raw cotton's being imported through the Clyde, but it's the dyes and things like that for making the finished cloth that the Glasgow chemical industry begins to cater for. Now, just as an aside here, we need to reflect on that, all of this goods that's coming into the Clyde doesn't come free of cost, and in this sense, environmental or ecological cost. And there is an unseen and unthought of, for the people of Glasgow who are involved in that trade, an unthought of consequence of what they're doing. We shouldn't be judging them, it's the standards of their time. But the big centres, particularly for sugar production in the Caribbean, and later for cotton and tobacco in the American colonies, and then from the Napoleonic Wars in the Indian Ocean in places like Mauritius, you're getting the development of vast acreages of a monoculture. This picture here is from Mauritius with one of the 19th century sugar plantations there. And these are obliterating the native ecologies, the native wildlife, the native plant life over vast areas. And so when you think about environmental legacies, we really need to be thinking about legacies of nearly 400 years of plantation cultivation around the globe, feeding the raw materials into centres, mainly in Europe, including Glasgow. Now, I've already mentioned that the one of the things that killed the sugar trade in Glasgow is the increasing size of ships and their inability to get into the small port of Glasgow. The development of Port Glasgow is one response to that, but the major response is the dredging of the Clyde. And this is possibly Glasgow's biggest single environmental impact on the region around it. And this time it was a conscious thing. To thrive, for Glasgow to grow and continue to develop as a mercantile and commercial centre, it needed access, easy access to the North Atlantic sea lanes. And so from the 1760s, you start to get the proposal of various schemes that are going to deepen the navigable channel of the river. And we've got to bear in mind that the river from the Broomielaw down the Clyde was actually, even at high tide, still relatively shallow. There were various points down the river where at low tide, it could still be forded. So you really had to choose, if you were a ship's captain, you had to choose your time for your run up the river into Glasgow. So to change that, you've got to make sure that there is permanent deep water. And they begin to put that in place by constructing stone dikes, rubble jetties projecting out into the river that are going to keep the water channeled down the main stream of the river. And the purpose behind that is going to provide the turbation of the bed of the river, which will scour out the silts, carry them away downstream, and perpetually keep that central channel scoured. And this, you've got in the picture here, you can see that deepened central channel with traces of the embankment in the mid-river there, which is part of the effort to get that deep water in place. Now, they're managing the river at this point in the 1760s through into the early 1800s. But it isn't enough. Ships are getting bigger, and if you want the bulk commodities going in and going out, you need to make sure that the channel is capable of taking them. And from the mid-1800s, you start to see millions of cubic meters of silt and bedrock being removed from the river. And that includes the great rock outcrop known as Eldersley Rock, which was one of the big obstacles in the outer channel, which is finally dynamited in the 1880s and removed from all memory, just completely obliterated. And the result is the creation of what is actually a managed canal that links the city with the Atlantic. And all of this is funded on Glasgow capital. This is a Glasgow corporate effort to basically make sure that the city thrived. Now, communications are also being developed in the other direction, and you know, there was a time when almost every Scottish school child would have been able to tell you the dates for the construction of the Forth and Clyde Canal, the Monkland Canal, things of that sort. Fashions have changed, but you know, the importance of the canals cutting through the central Midlands, leading from Glasgow down into the Lanarkshire coal fields, so the coal could be brought up to the canal basin at Townhead to feed the demands of the growing city. You know, these are immensely important. Again, being funded largely out of subscription and corporate efforts to ensure that the means of getting Glasgow's trade out there, able to reach East Coast ports, able to reach other Scottish population centres, but also able to continue to grow and develop by supplies of ironstone, by supplies of coal in particular, and also food and other raw materials that are going to keep the population of the city going. Now, these are immense ventures. They are transformative on a landscape scale. And again, it's something that has tended to be forgotten, is that the construction of these canals required the rerouting of natural waterways to supply the water on which the canal barges runs. And it transformed the hydrology of central Scotland just to build these things. I've been talking about raw commodities quite a lot, and some of the most important ones are still coming from quite far outside the city and being transported in. And in particular, it's those Loch Lomond oak woods, and to a lesser extent, the woodlands down south of Hamilton that are providing the raw materials. And by the mid-18th century, all the wood round about Loch Lomond, stuff that still has a tendency in popular literature to be presented as natural woodland, or wild wood, or remnants of the old Caledonian forest and all this sort of nonsense. This is actually intensively managed. No tree along Loch Lomond side is probably more than about 250 years old, because the woodland has been felled on a 15 to 25 year rolling basis. It's divided up into blocks known as hags, and these are carefully managed. They're preventing cattle from getting in there to graze them. They're preventing local populations from getting in there to damage them in any way. And this is mainly in demand, again, for bark, for tanning, for leather processing. But increasingly, you start to see big contracts being issued by the major landowners, like the Duke of Montrose on his Buchanan estate, again, like the Cahoons, the descendants of Malcolm of Luss, and even small families like the McFarlanes up at the head of Loch Lomond in Glenfalloch. They are signing contracts to supply bark and charcoal and wood into the commercial operations in the city. And you've got early processing centres which are making a lot of the wood byproducts that are hugely in demand. These are particularly things like pyroligneous acid, which is being made from oak charcoal, and it's mainly wanted for dye manufacture. So early centres are located down in the Vale of Leven, round about what is now Alexandria, for example, and Balach. And the Bonteen family out in that area is one of the big early investors in this. And a lot of it is linked to the linen weaving industries that are growing up around about the Vale of Leven. But the growing commercial pool of Glasgow saw such businesses begin to relocate at least part of their operation into the city by the early 1800s. And what you've got, this is just an example, are very early industrial developments. This is Turnbull and Ramsay's pyroligneous acid works in Camlachie Street off the Great Eastern Road. It was founded right at that period in the early 1800s, between about 1810, 1813. And what it does is it's through what's referred to as the destructive distillation of oak wood. It produces a whole range of commodities that were hugely in demand for the big industries of the day in Clydesdale in particular. So you've got mainly materials that have been used for making printing dyes and mordants, or ground charcoal that is used in iron foundries, as well as for the making of gunpowder. And the demand is immense. This is why the landscape around Loch Lomond is being organised in this almost industrial forestry manner in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So the demand is immense, but so too is its discharge of waste. And that is something we need to bear in mind as we move forward in the 19th century. But the biggest concern for Glasgow as we moved into the 1800s is how are they going to get an adequate fuel supply to keep the city's businesses going. Now, Glasgow itself sits over what used to be coal seams. And in my days when I was an insurance underwriter in Glasgow, we were forever having subsidence claims, particularly out in the Hill Head area, where it was old 17th, 18th century bell pits, which were gradually collapsing down into the ground below. But these were inadequate to supply the volume of coal that was needed for industrial processing. And you've also got the added problem that the owners of the Monkland Canal effectively ran a monopoly, and so there's very high freight charges for the bringing in of coal from the Lanarkshire coal fields. And so that monopoly then becomes a target from the Lanarkshire coal mine owners, and in 1826 they want to get as much of their coal as possible into Glasgow as cheaply as possible. And so they joined together to open the Monkland to Kirkintilloch Railway that then links up with the Forth and Clyde Canal to bring the commodity round into the Townhead Basin. And that leads to really rapid expansion, particularly of bituminous coal output. And that's ideal coal for coking purposes, for steel manufacture, or for coal gas, which will come. This is the era of the construction of the first great gasometers and gas production centres. But the emphasis on is bituminous gas, tongue in gear, is bituminous coal. It's dirty. It has got large quantities of tar in it, tar that's wanted for other processes, but it produces vast volumes of particularly blackening soot and various other, particularly sulfur byproducts that have an increasingly devastating impact, not just on the buildings of Glasgow, but on the lungs of the inhabitants of Glasgow, which leads to the expulsion, if you like, of many of Glasgow's middle classes out from the polluted city, out to the fresher air of Stirlingshire, parts of Dumbartonshire, and once you've got steam transport in place, going down the water and commuting in by boat up the Clyde. But along with it, you're also getting increased trade in ironstone from the Midland Valley. And this combination of coal and ironstone means that Glasgow's rapidly growing iron and chemical processing industries had the access to means of seemingly limitless growth. And the rapid expansion that we see, it's further driven forward as the railways really begin to take off through the 1840s and 1850s, the great age of rapid railway construction. And this is new routes, not just linking up the major centres, but reaching out deep into Glasgow's hinterland, the network being completed, well, actually in the early 1900s, but largely complete by the 1870s, early 1880s. So you've got coal and iron and steel on basically tap by the middle of the 19th century, and it reaches its peak output in the 1880s, just at the point where the navigable channel in the Clyde gets its modern, deepened nature, just in time to coincide with the peak development of the Upper Clyde shipbuilding industry. And it's going to maintain a dominance, largely almost by default. It has been suggested to me earlier tonight, possibly because of superior engine technology, but certainly it maintains a domination into the early 20th century, but it's already beginning to lose to international competition as the 1900s progress. But all of this, as I've already hinted, doesn't come without its costs. And winning that status as second city of empire by the middle of the 19th century really came at a high environmental cost to Glasgow and to Glaswegians. And this image looking up St Vincent Place and St Vincent Street really just drives home. These are relatively new buildings when this photograph was taken, and they're already soot blackened. And this is the consequence of the bituminous coal that is being burned in vast quantities, both in domestic fires, but by the industrial complexes round about. And its cost in human health terms is probably immeasurable. But it's one of these things that we can look back on. We get particularly exercised by the volumes of particulates in the air at present. But as that misty scene looking up St. Vincent Street there tells you, the volume of particulate in the second half of the 19th century would have sent modern public health inspectors into paroxysms of absolutely apoplectic rage. And it's in this period as well that we start to see an awakening within Glasgow's corporation to the consequences of all of this. The real driver had been the incredibly rapid growth of the city, as your industry doesn't just survive on raw materials, it actually needs workers. This is an era of manual industry, pre-automation. And so there is this incessant pool to Glasgow for employment purposes. And the city is not able to expand rapidly enough to accommodate them. And what you see happening at first is, as the middle classes begin to abandon the old medieval and early modern core of the city and moving out into the new town, out Blythswood direction, what had been the old high-class houses in the High Street, the Salt Market, the Gallowgate, these get divided down into multiple tenancy tenements and rapidly degenerate into slum. Hugely overcrowded, absolutely ridden with disease. This is the era of typhoid and cholera in all of Britain, but Glasgow suffers repeatedly and regularly. And so we've got an awakening to the threat within the city, to the health of the city, to the elites, as well as to the poor. It's the big pan-British epidemics of the early 1880s, which killed tens of thousands across the country, that are the really big drivers. We know in the 1848-49 epidemic, for example, of cholera, around 4,000 people died within what would be the physical footprint of Glasgow. And this really focuses the minds of physicians, but also what we would now class as civil engineers. And they really are homing in on the insanitary conditions in the slum districts. And the big breakthrough came not in Glasgow, it came in London. It's Dr. John Snow's hypothesis about London's Bright Street pump and its contamination by raw sewage, which apparently gave it the water from it a certain piquancy. And the responses to that to deliver pure drinking water, clean drinking water to people in even the poorest areas of London. And also the responses to what was known as London's Great Stink in 1858 from the sewage contaminated Thames. So much effluent from that city was going into the river that apparently in the height of summer, you could almost walk across the water because it was more solids than water. And so the great engineer Joseph Bazalgette's sewerage network in London pointed the way for the Glasgow City Corporation, pointed the direction that they should be travelling. And the big shift comes in 1866 with the passing in Parliament of the Glasgow City Improvement Act. And if any of you ever read it, it's actually quite a dry document, but it really gives the ability to the city fathers to raise the capital that they need to begin the process of replacement or introduction of proper sewerage and sanitation. And it's a direct response to their recognition of the risks that the presence of these centres within Glasgow posed. And so as part of that, emphasising what needed to be clear, you've got the commissioning of Thomas Annan from 1868 to 71 to produce the photographic records of the worst areas just before they're being cleared out. And the photograph on your screen at the moment, this is close as 97 and 103 Salt Market. where you've already got the central block that used to divide them demolished. But within this, you can see on both sides the open slop drains that ran the length of the closes. There's no enclosed drains here. There is no piped water here, other than that common stand pump in the centre bottom of the photograph there. And this was to supply the inhabitants of all the tenements around that close. So it's these kinds of conditions were what were being responded to. Now, even before the 1866 City Improvement Act, steps had begun to improve the water supply, and it's largely a response to not fear of contamination of the water, but shortage of water supply within Glasgow. But these early schemes are really catering mainly for the wealthy who could afford the piping, the lead piping to bring the water in, or for high demand businesses. And it drew filtered water from the Clyde at the Cunningar Loop over in Dalmarnock on the south side of the river, and it went through various filtration beds. But the piping was so leaky, it was never a great success. The 1848-9 cholera epidemic further underscored the inadequacy in the supply. And in 1855, the corporation, having actually undermined, I'll use that word, sabotage is probably the better word, an earlier attempt in Parliament to bring in another scheme. In 1855, the corporation secured permissions and approved plans to begin to bring water into the city from the Trossachs. And this is Glasgow really beginning to flex its muscles and demonstrate its reach far beyond the physical limits of Glasgow City Corporation's territory. And so from 1855 onwards, they're starting to put in place an infrastructure to bring water from Loch Katrine here in the photograph. So now, to do this, Loch Katrine's level had to be raised. A tunnel was also dug through later to Loch Artlet to help ensure a perennial supply. And Loch Venacher, downstream from Loch Katrine, also had to have its level raised as a compensation reservoir, because they have to recognise if you're piping millions of gallons of water from Loch Katrine, you're affecting the flow down the various rivers that feed ultimately into the Teeth and down into the Forth. And that affects all the communities down there, all the riparian owners, all the people who had fishing rights, the industrial complexes at places like Deanston. So you had to raise Venacher's level so that compensation water could be released into the river. And this still gets talked about as having had minimal environmental impact, but it's actually transformative of the water supply within an entire catchment in central Scotland. That is the scale of Glasgow's impact by the middle of the 19th century on central Scotland. And the corporation scheme, gets bigger and bigger, but really almost continuously after the completion in 1859 of the first big phase of the scheme. And if you go out just to Mugdock Country Park or to Milngavie and walk around the reservoirs there, the successive reservoirs chart the successive phases of the development. And each of these basically is holding water brought in from Loch Katrine and Loch Artlet for final purification before it was then piped into the city. And in the grander scheme of things, relatively small acreage is covered, but again, this is artificial construction. It is the flooding of land to be able to supply the city with its drinking and sanitation water needs. Now, very appropriately, we come to sanitation, and this is the bit that quite a few people find one of the biggest horror stories. And is, although you had piped mains water being brought into Glasgow, certainly from the early 1800s, but on a grand scale from the 1850s, it's not matched by any improvement in waste treatment. And so almost all the industrial effluent, sewage, and wastewater from a city of several 100,000 people with major industry all around it was discharged directly into the Kelvin, the Clyde, and of course the Mollendinner and other water courses like that. And although the pollution was never quite as bad as the Thames in the 1850s, the Clyde was still described in the 1870s as one of the UK's most polluted rivers. And we know that already by then, the effluent in the river had utterly destroyed the salmon fishery upstream and contaminated the shellfish beds in the tidal estuary of the river. Nobody in their right mind would have eaten anything coming out of the Clyde in those days. So you've got the best part of half a century after the introduction of piped water before in 1894 you get the first sewage treatment works opened again at Dalmarnock. And ironically, it's upstream from the city to the southeast. So, but the purpose there was that the prevailing westerly winds carried the smell away from Glasgow over in the direction of those east coast cities. But the problem, of course, with Dalmarnock is it's too far inland for the easy piping of the waste sludge from there to the sea. And what you had instead was the carting of it downstream, first of all to Shield Hall, but also to the Broomy Law for loading up and carting down the river for dumping. But you've got a second plant is opened in 1904 at Dalmuir, and finally in 1910 you've got the Shield Hall plant. Now a lot of what's being produced is sold as fertilizer. Sludge cake fertilizer production only ended in 1935. Now this seemed like a good use. You're making money, the city fathers are making money that's going back into the city coffers. The problem, as we only belatedly established, is that putting human sewage back into agriculture is a good way of concentrating heavy metals in what people are eating. So the lead and the zinc that are being taken in daily diet and water consumption is being concentrated in the potatoes and things like that that are being grown in human sewage fertilized land. So instead, you start to see more of the surplus taken down to Shield Hall and out for dumping at sea. A pipeline is finally completed in 1914 so that there isn't the sight of the sludge wagons going through the city anymore. And that allowed the waste to be loaded directly onto the sludge ships and taken out to Garrick Head and Butte for dumping in the deep Clyde. And this is another example of entrepreneurial spirit in the city of Glasgow, that you could actually take your trips down the water on the sludge vessels. It was first offered during the First World War as part of the convalescence treatment for wounded soldiers, but it later took off as an actual tourist venture. What probably shocks people most, though, is that it was over a century after the construction of the Dalmarnock sewage plant that dumping at sea is finally halted. And that was 7 years after the UK had signed up to the EU's Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, which was designed to help to clear up polluted waterways. It's 10 years, though, before the new waste treatment works out at Milngavie was put in place, which allowed for the enhanced treatment of the high waste volumes that were still being produced in the city. It's one of the less edifying stories about the environmental impact of the city. Now, most of it, despite some of these negatives on the public health side, so far it has generally been a picture of growth and expansion. But one of the things that we see had happened to Glasgow is that there was general underinvestment in new technologies and plant, particularly in the post-World War immediate aftermath. So when the opportunities were there in the 1920s and 1930s, you were not seeing new plant being introduced or experimented with in a big way. And as a consequence, Clydeside heavy industry really began to lose the competitive edge that it once had to international competitors now. Now, alongside this, you've also got a determination to try and build back better. First of all, by building homes for heroes after the First World War, to begin to make inroads into the slum developments of the later 19th centuries. And again, a lot of this work has been carried out by the City Improvement Trust. But after World War II, this begins to accelerate particularly. And it's in areas, mainly Clydebank, it has to be said, rather than the core of Glasgow proper, but it's mainly looking to replace housing that had been destroyed by German bombing. But all of this is happening too at a time when there's a general background of economic decline. And the contraction is leaving a legacy of brownfield sites, many of them heavily contaminated by the residues of a century of unregulated dumping of byproducts from industrial processes. And conscious of time now, but I'm moving rapidly towards the end here. And what we see is the putting forward of blueprints, of plans. So the 1945 Glasgow Corporation Bruce report and the government's 1949 Clyde Valley Regeneration Plan are putting forward alternative proposals for how we can arrest the decline in Glasgow. The Bruce report, thank God it wasn't implemented, because most of central Glasgow, as we now know it, would have been demolished to make way for a concrete brutalist vision, zoned industry and retail. And the Clyde Valley scheme was largely for the construction of new towns, leading to the development of Cumbernauld, East Kilbride, Irvine, Glenrothes, Livingston eventually. But also the building out on the periphery of major new housing schemes, including things like the Red Road flats. But one of the consequences of this as well was a recognition of the need if we're going to get new industries, new technologies into the city, we need to improve infrastructure for transport. And transport then meant roads. And it's in this period that the decision is made to upgrade the A8, and you get the construction of that great scar that cuts central Glasgow in two, that is now the M8 motorway. But the environmental legacy of Glasgow's Newtown overspill is also immense. These places required new water, sewerage, power, transport infrastructure, massive volumes of concrete. Concrete was the new material of the era. It accounts for up to 8% of the world's carbon emissions. And the steel reinforcing also carries a high carbon footprint. So think about the volumes of CO2 that went into the construction of the concrete supports, the flyovers that carry the M8 around the north side of the city. And an additional factor in all of this is that this was constructing a world that was built around a vision where everybody would own a car. It's a new utopia where nobody was tied by public transport. Traffic volumes soared, atmospheric pollution with the high lead petrol of the age had CO2, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and various nitrous oxides, particulates and volatile organic compounds, all being released into an atmosphere that was only just beginning to clear from the bituminous coal pollution of the previous 100 years. But there are positives, and it was recognized, in the 1870s as one of the most polluted rivers in Britain. It is the Clyde's regeneration, the setting up in the 1950s of the Clyde River Purification Board that begins a process of education, investment in drainage, new sewerage infrastructure, also industrial decline. But public education is a huge factor in bringing about change. And by 1983, you saw the first fruits of this when migratory salmon returned to the river for the first time in over a century. And now, well, I've probably run out of time to be able to take us far into this, but just this picture of Loch Lomond from Ben Lomond with that white line snaking up it is our environmental footprints are still immense and they are global. And we need to think very, very long and hard about every step, every change we make, and the way in which every action will have a counteraction, a consequence. And so when we're planning for an environmentally greener future, we also need to remember that there will be negative consequences, negative in cultural terms, negative potentially in economic terms. But we need to be balancing up the needs of the future against the here and now. Thank you.
Professor Richard, thank you very, very much indeed. That's it. As you said, it was going to be a gallop through what we've done in Glasgow, but you have certainly, I had no idea of the decimation event of the 1340s, but what you've taken us through from that time to this has kept me fascinated through the centuries. And at the moment, I'm just hoping that we're going to get some questions from the audience, but in the meantime, I just wondered, from my own research, I had reason to look at the current pollution of the Clyde and noted that until diluted by the Kelvin, the Clyde upstream of here is still not suitable for bathing because of chromium-6 from the old Shorefield chemical works, which lies beneath the dog track.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any other particular instances where we're still paying such penalties?
Well, there's pretty well anywhere where you've got a brownfield site, we now have to do all kinds of environmental checking because there is the legacy of contaminants, and you just think go further up the Clyde with the remediation of the old Ravenscraig site, for example, which cost hundreds of millions. Just to take out the heavy metal contaminants, the arsenic, all the other things that were leaching into the water table and would find its way into the Clyde. So all of that, where you've got demolition sites, where you have got asbestos, for example, there's large quantities of lead kicking around in the soil all around the greater Glasgow area. So yeah, there's pretty well any place where there has been a past physical footprint of industrial processing, mining, metalworking, anything of that kind, there is going to be a legacy of contaminants. And it's going to take decades of remediation to remove those.
I'm just looking now, I'm beginning to see some response from the audience. I think they were obviously, some of them were obviously gobsmacked by your description of it, but certainly we've got a comment from Jonathan Glenn that just says, absolutely brilliant. And I think that actually sums quite a lot of it up. And I've also got another question from Tricia Fort. Did or could global warming help Glasgow to become a successful port by allowing the sea level to rise and thus work with dredging to deepen the river channel?
It may have helped in the sense of during the era when the first deepening operations were active from the 1760s onwards, where they're using the actual flow of the river. Because that is in the latter stages of the Little Ice Age. So it's not global warming, it's actually in the previous era of intense cooling, where rainfall levels were higher. And so you've got a much greater level of runoff in the headwaters of the Dar and the Clyde and the Avon and the various other streams that are flowing in. So yes, you've got a greater flow of water coming down the river at that time. So a fortunate byproduct of climate change, and I say, climate change of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's how we respond to it, and it's only when climate change starts to get into the rates and scales that we are now seeing that it actually moves from being something that can be accommodated into something that actually really poses a threat on a major scale. So it's in these earlier episodes, it's still within a manageable parameter for humans around the world. We're moving beyond that threshold, certainly if they don't get their statements right from COP26.
I think that's fascinating, and I might just ask one other question from my actually I've got some more coming in from Tom Allen. Does what you have described explain the so-called Glasgow effect on health?
Part of it. Yeah, I mean, the industrial legacies are a huge factor in this. You're looking at a low-waged economy for much of the 18th and 19th century, and that has long-term legacies in terms of diet, particularly. As I alluded to in the slide about the Glasgow sugaries, from the 1660s, you've got the bulk supply of sugar coming into the West Coast, and Glaswegians, Scots in general, developed an early sugar fixation. It's still there, but you're looking at people who have, the bulk of the population is generally unable to afford good quality food. They're going already in the 19th and earlier 20th centuries for what then would pass as the more processed foods, the cheaper end of output, and they're living in substandard housing. So there's a double whammy effect, and to cap it all, they're living in a very, very heavily atmospheric polluted environment. It's one as well where even their drinking water until the second half of the 20th century is largely coming through lead pipes, and that in itself has got a consequence on health. So yeah, there is what you see happening to Glasgow as a result of Glasgow's growth, is that flip negative side on the health of a large volume of the population.
I think the whole thing has been, to me, absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much indeed. And I think perhaps as we get to sort of 8:15, I think probably I hope no one's supper is still in the oven and has actually caught fire with the consequent environmental problems that causes. Professor Richard, I've just got to say thank you very, very much for the most interesting, challenging talk. And on behalf of the Society, its directors, and of all of the Trades House, can I just say thank you very, very much indeed. And I suspect that if the Deacon Convener was actually part of the hosts and presenters, he would wish to actually say something else, and say thank you. But all the comments that I can see coming up are just saying brilliant, fantastically interesting, and I can only echo those words and just say thank you very much indeed. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you and Professor Richard, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for your attendance, and hopefully we go home a little bit wiser about Glasgow.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.